You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. The Tower of Babel is a familiar story in the Bible for many people. It conjures up images of a large Tower of Pisa-like structure, half-built, and people speaking different languages all of a sudden confused why they can't understand each other. But what if I told you that that's not actually the way the story goes in the Bible? The tower would have looked more like a pyramid, and the story may not even be about the origin of different languages. Instead, it might be about the ways that empires push us into uniformity. Find out why, coming up. As we look at the Tower of Babel story this week, we need to pause first and address some of the bigger concepts at hand here, because this is a very familiar story to many. And while familiarity can be a good thing, it can also lead us to think we know more about the story than we actually do. A lot trickles down from traditions, the way we heard it in Sunday school or in a sermon, and sometimes we don't even realize the assumptions that we're bringing to the text. So first, let's note that this is not a unique story to the Bible. There are stories from all around the world of languages being divided. Interestingly enough, some even follow shortly after the flood myths from those cultures. A couple of examples I can give of some of these other stories, and you might even recognize the similarities pretty quickly. One comes from the IVP, Bible Background Commentary, and it reads, "The account of a time when all mankind spoke a single language is preserved in Sumerian in the epic entitled Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. It speaks of a time when there were no wild beasts and only harmony among people. The whole universe in unison spoke to Enlil," that's one of the gods, "in one tongue. It then reports that speech was changed and contention was brought into it. There is nothing else in this account that parallels the Tower of Babel, but confusion of language by deity can be seen as an ancient theme." End quote. Now, I'm going to come back to this idea in a little bit here, because there's a concept I'm going to propose in this week's episode, or at least introduce to you, that takes a very different view on the Tower of Babel than just the standard God confusing the languages, and I think this quote will play into it then as well. In The Lost World of the Flood, John Walton mentions another ancient mythology that's similar to this. He says, in A&E, that's ancient Near Eastern literature, there is a familiar motif known as the irreverent king that typically identifies offense in a particular king whose unsanctioned actions are interpreted as leading to the downfall of a city, dynastic line, or empire. Near the end of what is known as the Third Dynasty, Amar-Sun, and this is around 2046 to 2038 BC, the son of the famous long-lived Shulgi, was on the throne of and is portrayed as just such an irreverent king. A sequence of events during his reign sounds some familiar themes. Though the political center of the empire was in the nearby town of Eridu held great religious significance as the center of power for the god Enki. The construction of the temple and ziggurat of Enki at Eridu had been launched by the first king of the dynasty, Namu, but he had been unable to complete it. Amar-Sun undertook to complete this project, but year after year could not gain the permission of the gods. Usually, one of the greatest desires of the gods was to have their temples built, so it was considered a sign of deep consternation for permission not to be granted. Nevertheless, Amar-Sun eventually proceeded, unclear whether he gained permission or not, and furthermore explicitly did so to make his name everlasting. End quote. That has a lot of similarities to the biblical story. One more I'll give you. This comes from around the time of the prophet Isaiah, so roughly 700 BCE. There was an Assyrian king named Sargon II. He is mentioned once in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah. I think it's around chapter 20, if I remember correctly. So Sargon II was an Assyrian king who fell in battle, and he is one of the only, if not the only, Assyrian king to die in battle whose body was never recovered. Just the way that the battle went, his troops were not able to bring him back to where their camp was. And that was not a good thing. In the ancient culture, this would have been seen by his people as a sign of divine disfavor. If your body as a king could not be buried in your own land, that must be because the gods were really ticked off at you for some reason. So some scholars look at this and think that it was because of a city that he built that he failed to seek divine approval for. So you see a similarity there in this story of Sargon II and the one that Walton mentioned about Amarsun and how he did not get permission from the deity to build the temple that he wanted to make. Now, if you're saying, well, those stories are about temples and this story in the Bible is about a tower, where are you drawing that connection? Well, the Tower of Babel would not have been a tower in the sense that we often think of it. At least in my mind, I kind of picture those Renaissance-style paintings where it almost looks like a giant Tower of Pisa or something like that, and it's left off incomplete, but it basically ends up looking like either like the Roman Colosseum just stacked up on top of itself or the Tower of Pisa or something along those lines. However, most scholars today would suggest that that's really far off of what this would have been at the time. In the ancient Mesopotamian culture of that region, they didn't really build towers that looked like giant silos. What they did build were ziggurats. And ziggurats look kind of like pyramids, but they are much more like a set of staircases. Like if you imagined the pyramids, but instead of a relatively smooth surface going down, imagine each one being a very pronounced step going up. That's essentially the idea of a ziggurat. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through the episode today about the significance of the ziggurat and especially the top of it. But these would have been religious structures, almost like temples, where it was anticipated that the God of your people would come down from the heavens and live on the top of this ziggurat. So it wasn't really something that the average person would be able to go up to. In fact, they would probably be killed if they tried to. This was something that basically only the priest would be able to ascend the ziggurat and take care of the area on top of it that was designed for the gods. So most scholars would say that this Tower of Babel was actually a ziggurat, something that was purposefully made to house gods. That changes the way that we read the story, and I think it fits really well within the context of the other stories that we have had in this series so far, going all the way back to the Sons of God in chapter 6, and I'll touch on that more as we go. But I think that is important to keep in mind. It's also important to realize that the word translated Babel is Bavel in Hebrew. And Bavel is the word that is translated Babylon in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. So when you see Tower of Babel, it's actually the Tower of Babylon. It is the exact same word. It should be translated the same way. It just seems to be that tradition had it translated as Babel, which is really a transliteration at this point. But then in every other instance that the word shows up outside of this chapter, it's always translated Babylon. So that's a point of contention I have with the majority of English translations. Quite a few of them say Tower of Babel just out of tradition, but it's the Tower of Babylon, and that makes a huge difference because this is the start of Israel's story. In fact, just at the end of this chapter, we're going to get there today in the episode, we're introduced to Abraham, the father of the Israelite people, the progenitor of this people group that is going to take up the story of the rest of this Tanakh. And where the story ends is in Babylon. The people are taken into captivity in Babylon. So right here at the very beginning of the Tanakh, we have the origins of Babylon. We talked about it with Nimrod last week. And here we have it showing up again. So the story begins and ends in Babylon. And we miss that when we think that this is something separate from that. So I like to call this the Tower of Babylon because it helps to keep that link between the beginning and the ending of the Old Testament or the Tanakh. And while many people probably think that our English word Babel comes from this story, that is actually not likely the case. Just look at the spellings. The word Babel used in most English translations of the Bible is B-A-B-E-L. And again, that is a transliteration of the Hebrew that would be spelled basically B-A-B-E-L or B-A-V-E-L, depending on how the transliteration works. Same word, it's just in Hebrew, the B and the V can be the same letter sometimes. There are a few different nuances, but you might see it transliterated Bavel or Babel. And some people even say this is the Tower of Babel, which kind of makes that distinction. That's kind of an Americanized pronunciation, but Bavel would be the closest thing to Hebrew. But I like to go with Babylon just because that is what the word means through the rest of the Bible. Now, if you look at the English word Babel, that is B-A-B-B-L-E. Different spelling, comes from a different root. So I think a lot of Christians seem to think, oh, well, language was confused here at the Tower of Babel, and all these different languages came out, and people didn't know what everyone else was saying. It sounded like people were babbling. So since you didn't understand what they were talking about, now we have this word in English for when you don't understand what someone's saying, they're just babbling on. That's not the case, though. These are two separate words from two separate roots. Babel in the Bible is just a transliteration of the Hebrew. Babel in English seems to have come from a very old dialect of German. So it's just a very strange coincidence that these words with similar connotations end up sounding very similar across very different languages. But our English word Babel does not actually come from this story. Just a very strange coincidence that it kind of fits, even though that's not how it happened. Speaking of languages, the Bible never says what the original language of humanity would have been. I think a lot of Christians, when they read this story, they just have an assumption that all of humanity spoke one language up until the time of the Tower of Babel, or Babylon, and then after that, that's how we have all of these different languages. And people guess at what the original language of humanity might have been. I've heard some people suggest Hebrew because that's the language that the Old Testament was written in. But there are several languages that predate the biblical Hebrew language. And just because that is what this story was written in does not mean that there weren't other languages before that. The Bible is not the oldest story out there about human origins and the way that people groups started. There are others as well. And really, it doesn't make a difference. There's nothing special about having the first language ever spoken by humans. Pretty much every group seems to think that whatever their language is was possibly the first language of humanity. There are some Islamic traditions that say the first language was Syriac. So it just kind of seems to be this thing where cultures just assume that their language was the original one of humans and everything else split off from theirs. But it really doesn't make a difference. There's nothing magical or special about that. And in fact, a lot of linguists would suggest that there never really was a first language that all people spoke, but that very early on in humanity's development, there were already multiple languages. Now, this is something that we need to touch on because it shows up a little bit here in the way that this text is structured. If you listened to last week's episode on Genesis 10, you might remember that Genesis 10:5 says, "By these were all the coasts of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." So already before chapter 11 and the Tower of Babylon story that we have today, we have people groups being divided up by the languages that they spoke. Now, there are a couple different ways you can look at this. Some people think that this was just recorded out of order. This is something that the Net Bible suggests. It says Genesis 11 begins with everyone speaking a common language, but chapter 10 has the nations arranged by languages. It is part of the narrative art of Genesis to give the explanation of the event after the narration of the event. End quote. So what they're suggesting is that this is a pattern where you'll be given an introduction to the story and then told the story. It's kind of like how we had at the very beginning of Genesis 1, the introductory verse, and then the same thing in chapter 2's account. So they're suggesting that Genesis 10 is not saying that people were already divided by language before the Tower of Babylon, but that these two chapters, 10 and 11, are meant to be read together. 10 is introducing what happens in 11. That is absolutely a possible way to read this. I believe it is also possible to say that there were already different languages before the Tower of Babylon. And this is based on a view that is becoming a little more prominent, and it's suggesting that the Tower of Babylon story is not actually about having one language that then gets split up into multiple languages. Let me say that again, because that will probably surprise many of you. I'm guessing that's the only interpretation you've ever heard of this passage. But there is a growing perspective on this text that says it is not about humanity having one language and God's splitting that into multiple different languages. Rather, it is suggesting that humanity had one purpose that they were starting to create this empire, and that the empire was pushing a uniformity of message that was against Yahweh's way. And that was the problem. Not that people were all speaking one language, and then as a result of this sin at the tower, God splits it into multiple languages, but actually that there already were multiple languages, and that it was the message, the belief systems of these people that changed here at the tower. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, don't worry, I'm going to explain why that happens. But first, let's just look at the verses of this passage, because this part isn't that long, and I think it would help if you have the whole story for context. So, Genesis 11, this is going to be verses 1 through 9, and it reads, "The whole earth, or the whole land, was of one language and of one speech. It came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a tower and a city, whose top may reach to heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men built. And Yahweh said, Behold, the people are one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the land, and they left off to build the city. Therefore it is called Babel, or Babylon, because Yahweh did there confound the language of all the earth, and from there Yahweh did scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth, or land. So that's the story, and I can absolutely understand why people would take out of it the traditional view that everyone spoke one language, and that God changed that here at the tower. But there is a bit of a wrench in the gear, and that is the word that is translated language. It's the Hebrew word sapah, and it's not necessarily the word that would usually be translated language. It is possible that it could mean language here, but it very literally just means lip. And then the word that is translated speech is just the standard word for a word, a message. It can even just kind of be a generic something, anything. It is a very generic word, meaning word or message. So if we look at that first verse again from this lens, it says that the whole earth was of one lip and one message. So some have suggested that this does not mean one language, but rather that humanity had one purpose, that as they were banding together under men like Nimrod, they were creating one conglomerate of beliefs, that they were swallowing all of the rhetoric of this one politician, if you will, this one king, and building a single empire to rule everything, putting too much power in one person's hands. So then the one lip, quote unquote, that everybody is speaking is one message, one ideal, just the message of this empire that promotes uniformity over unity. The message, especially of the New Testament, is one of unity for believers. But what a lot of systems promote is not unity, but uniformity. See, unity is where you and I can have differences, but if we're rowing in the same direction, if we have the same general goal, we can work together. Uniformity does not allow room for differences. And even though a lot of churches and even a lot of businesses or organizations will try to promote unity and say that they care about unity, what they actually promote is uniformity. You have to ask yourself, am I allowed to have a difference of opinion here, or am I going to be treated differently because of it? If you're treated differently because you don't follow the main rhetoric of a political party or a church or a business or what have you, that is not unity, that is uniformity. And that is bad. And that's what some scholars are saying the message of this passage is, that uniformity through the message of empire is actually a bad thing. And I think there is something to this, because if you remember from when we talked about the stuff you don't know about Genesis, it was in our Genesis 1 through 6 series, I mentioned that even though these stories in the Tanakh and especially Genesis existed for many years in oral tradition, they weren't really written down until later on. and then they weren't necessarily compiled into one big corpus like we have in what we call the Old Testament until the time of the exile. So we're talking the time in between the Testaments, the Second Temple period, as it is called, the 400 years in between the Old and New Testaments, as many Christians would think of it. That's when the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is being compiled. That's when the scribes are editing these stories together and making them all fit into one big coherent story. So this is then after the Babylonian exile. So it is fitting for people who have been oppressed by Babylon to tell a version of their story that begins by saying the uniform message of an empire that began at Babylon is a bad thing. Bad things happen when people group together under the banner of this empire. It totally makes sense that that would be a sore point to them because they were just coming out of that. So they are kind of retroactively looking back at this story and presenting it through the lens of the captivity that they have recently been in. Further backing up this position is the work that some scholars have been doing in probably about the last 10 to 20 years here, of looking at other ancient Mesopotamian work from even before the time that this would have been written, and they're finding similarities to this story where there is talk of people having one message, one lip, if you will, one belief system, and when it is in opposition to what the king believed, it was viewed as treason. Now, this is something that Sam Boyd mentions on an episode of The Bible for Normal People, and I have put this in the show notes because it is a fantastic resource to listen to alongside this episode. So I would highly recommend, as soon as you have time for another podcast episode and the brain power for it, because I know this is coming from a different angle, go ahead and listen to that episode of Bible for Normal People, because he goes into this in even more detail than I do, and I think it'll be a help to you in understanding this position. So they're taking this information from other sources outside of the Bible in Mesopotamia of that time and seeing similar language of one lip and meaning that people had one belief system. And so they're applying that here and suggesting that the belief system that they had was opposed to what Yahweh would have wanted. And we see this even in something as subtle as verse 2 when it says that they journeyed. Now, most translations will say from the east, and that is a very literal way to translate it. But it seems better to say that they journeyed in the east, because everything here is basically central to Israel. We have to remember this is an ancient Israelite document that we are reading. So they see themselves as the center of the world. That's basically what all of these ancient cultures did. You can find maps from ancient cultures online, and pretty much all of them have their country in the center of the world. So the directions that we have are relative to where ancient Israel is located. So it makes more sense to say that they were journeying to the east rather than from the east. And any journey to the east in the Bible should make you worried. We've addressed this every time it's come up in the Bible so far, but moving east is always a bad thing because, again, it's relative to where Israel is located. Israel is located right on the Mediterranean Sea on the west, so you can't go west from there, at least not without taking a boat. So moving east is going away from the land that you're supposed to be in as an ancient Israelite. So moving east is almost always a bad thing in the Bible. Adam and Eve leave the garden and go east. Cain goes east from the presence of God. Even in the last chapter, we had humanity going east, and especially toward the mountains, and the mountains were where the gods lived. So these are really bad images that we are being given, where just by saying that these people moved east, we should be on edge a little bit, wondering what's about to happen. And verse 2 says that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Now, Shinar would be another word for Sumer, ancient Babylonia area, but Babylon would be a little bit anachronistic of a term at this point, because the ancient Babylonian Empire really didn't begin for quite a while after this story. So we have a couple options here. This is either the author using a later place name in order to make the story more understandable, or it could actually be that they were building this tower at a location further northwest than where we would normally think of as Babylon today. Either one of those is possible. A lot of good scholars are kind of leaning toward the idea that this may have been further up in the northwest, particularly once we start talking about Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham came from, because they kind of wonder why would it be called that if it's just the standard Ur that is in the region of Babylon. So they assume that maybe it's one that's a little bit further northwest that was found relatively recently in archaeology. It would clear up some issues. But I think it is also possible that this is just the author using the later place name of Babylon, even though that would not have been the name of the place at this time. That happens at other times in the Bible. And sometimes they signal it, saying, it's called this to this day, or it used to be called this in that day. But sometimes it just happens like this as well. Either way, it's not a huge issue, but it is worth noticing. Before I go any further, I should also note that Nimrod does not show up in this chapter at all. Now, tradition tells us that he was the person who built this tower, and that's because chapter 10 says that the beginning of his kingdom was at Babylon. But nothing specifically says that he commissioned the building of this structure, or even that he was the king at that point. We don't know how much time passes between chapter 10 and chapter 11. And like we mentioned earlier, depending on how you interpret this, you might think that these chapters are concurrent, that they're supposed to be read as happening at the same time, or maybe there's time in between. So for all we know, this could have been a long time after Nimrod began the kingdom at Babylon, or it could very well have been in his rule. We don't know. It's just kind of something that tradition has put the two stories together. And he may very well have been there at the time. He may not have been. It's not clear within the scriptures. Something else that isn't very clear in the story, and this might be a little controversial, but it's not clear what the motivation of the people was for building the tower. Now you might say, hold up, Colin, it says right there, they say, let's build a tower to reach up to heaven and to make a name so that we're not scattered abroad across the whole earth. Well, yes, but when you think about that, that's still very generic. It doesn't really say why they had this fear or what they were actually trying to accomplish with this. And there are a few different suggestions. Some people think that this tower building was specifically in response to the flood. See, it says that they went into the plains. Now, the plains area, that's lowland, it would have been the first to flood. So it kind of makes sense from that point of view that they would have been wanting to build something to reach up into the skies there. Something that if another flood were to happen, they would all be able to survive it in this tower. However, that doesn't really hold up when you realize that this was not a tower like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but that was actually a ziggurat. And if it was a ziggurat, that's not something the average person would have just been able to climb up. They would not have been allowed there. It would have just been for the priest to go up and for the god to be there. So even though that's something that I believed for a while, and it really makes sense that this is in response to the flood, I don't think that that would make sense from an ancient context because normal people would not have been allowed to inhabit this tower. It's not even something they could have climbed up in the event of another flood. It's something that would have only been for the priest to go up and for the gods to come down. So if this isn't in response to the flood, what is their purpose for wanting to build this ziggurat, this holy place for their gods? Well, I think we need to focus on how they talk about making a name. This is like the key to the passage. And it especially helps when we understand that in an ancient Near Eastern culture, if you were building something for your god, you were expected to obtain the god's blessing before you did that. This was even the case in building a city. In many of these cultures, if you were going to build a city, you were supposed to seek the blessing of your god before you did this. Now, there is no record of the people in this story asking any god's permission, be that Yahweh or someone else. They just go ahead and do it. And it even seems to me like this is an inversion, or maybe even a mockery of God's creative speech in Genesis 1. Notice how they say, go to, let us build. That go to, or it's translated differently in some different translations. It's a very hard word to translate into English. Basically, it means, come on, let's do this. It's just a way to invite you into an action. And it's very similar to the ways that God said, let us do XYZ throughout chapter 1. Let there be light. Let us make humans in our image, so forth and so on. And so this is almost like an inversion of that, where they are taking the roles of gods and saying, let us do this in and of our own power. So that seems to be the affront here, that they are trying to do this without the permission of any god. They are doing this about themselves. Now, it may very well be that they were connecting this to some gods, be that Yahweh or a different god, it's never specified. But the very fact that this would have been a ziggurat implies that this has something to do with bringing down the presence of a god. But they did it without the approval or the blessing of that god. They're just doing this on their own. Now, I have a rather lengthy section here that I want to read to you from John Walton's The Lost World of the Flood. It is really helpful in understanding the context of what's going on here. So let's take a look at what he says about this. It should first be noted that the account of the Tower of Babel has authentic roots in the period that ranges from the end of the 4th millennium through the first quarter of the 3rd millennium BC. In terms of the technologies referred to, burned brick technology was unique to Mesopotamia, where the location in the alluvial plains would have required stones to be imported over great distances and only at great expense. As a more expedient alternative, bitumen mortar was commonly used with kiln-fired brick. This technology is first attested in the late Uruk period and becomes more common in the Jemdet Nasir period, thus dating to the end of the 4th millennium. This technology was used in public buildings and at the beginning of urbanization. Cities of this period comprised public buildings only, primarily the temple complex. That's going to be important. He goes on, importantly, and against the history of interpretation, such a structure did not provide a way for humans to ascend, as Genesis 11:5 itself attests, but for gods to descend. That is huge. Most people think, this is me talking here, most people think that the Tower of Babylon was a way for these people to go up to the heavens. Like, if God is up there, we're going up to him. But that's not what these ziggurats were about. They were about making space for the gods to come down. These people weren't stupid. They knew that you couldn't go up to heaven. It was just about recreating something that looked like a mountain because they believed that the gods lived on mountains. So we don't have a mountain right where we are. We're in a plains area. So we're going to create a mountain. We're going to give the gods a place to come down and be with us. Walton continues. Ziggurats were part of sacred space and inaccessible to the public. They were not temples per se, because there were no rituals performed and no image of the deity was present there. But they were considered part of sacred space, and thus their names were prefaced with the same Sumerian designations as the temples. The ziggurat was a stairway from heaven.
Hey! No stairway! Denied!
It is not difficult to determine that desiring not to scatter was natural. In Genesis 13, Abraham and Lot did not want to separate, but circumstances demanded it. Scattered families bring discontinuity and disrupt relationships and traditions being passed on. The need for scattering was somewhat resolved through urbanization, which city building addressed. The need to scatter due to limited food inhibited order. Building a city represented an attempt to bring increased order to their lives. So, me speaking here, that seems like a good thing, because God wanted us to increase the order in the land. See, there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. You can view cities through a negative lens in Scripture, which is how they are often presented, or you can see these little glimmers of hope where there are positive things about them, and Bible Project has a fantastic series that traces this theme of the city all the way up to the end of Revelation, where you have God's presence in what we would often think of as heaven, but it's actually in the form of a city come down with us. Highly recommend checking out that series. It's fantastic. Okay, back to Walton. Consequently, contrary to a strong tradition to identify the offense of the builders as disobedience to the creation mandate, quote-unquote, fill the earth, we must note that for there to be disobedience, there must be a command. Let me pause for a second, because this is huge. I have heard plenty of sermons where the preacher is trying to say that the Tower of Babel was an affront to God's creation mandate to fill the earth. But Walton is making the case that that is not what happened, and I agree with him here. Listen to why he is saying this is not a disobedience to the creation mandate. So he goes on, we must note that for there to be disobedience, there must be a command. No connection should be drawn to the creation mandate in Genesis 1, because filling is accomplished by reproduction, not by geographical dispersion. Let me say that again. Filling is accomplished by reproduction, not by geographical dispersion. In other words, they could still fill the earth even if they remained in this one place. He continues, furthermore, the so-called creation mandate is not a command, but a blessing, and cannot be disobeyed. I love how he says that. I drew on that when we did our Genesis 1 through 6 series. The creation mandate is not a mandate. It is a blessing, and you can't disobey a blessing. Back to Walton. Regarding making a name, it is important to recognize that it was naturally desirable for people to achieve that objective. It was not intrinsically prideful. It was accomplished by anything that resulted in one being remembered. It could be motivated by pride, but was perhaps more importantly associated with the idea that a person might benefit in the afterlife by their name being remembered. While conquests or great building projects could accomplish that end, so could having children. The building project in the passage would certainly qualify to make a name for the builders, but it is more difficult to identify the desire to make a name as an offense to God. Pause. That is also a crucial distinction to make, because a lot of people think that by building this tower, they were essentially giving a middle finger to God, saying it's about our making a name for ourselves instead of a name for you. However, there is nothing wrong with humans wanting a lasting legacy. That is common to the majority of us. And like Walton points out, it's about being remembered even in the afterlife. The best illustration I can think of from recent culture on that is the Disney, I think it was Pixar movie, Coco, and how the idea in that movie is of family members being remembered even after they have gone on. Kind of a similar idea happening here. Walton continues. In order to understand the offensive nature of the project, we have to dip into the cognitive environment of the ancient world. We've previously introduced the concept of the Great Symbiosis to describe the system wherein the gods had created humanity to meet their needs, which was the goal of the rituals of the ancient world. In turn, the gods met the needs of humanity, provision and protection. This symbiosis resulted in codependence and is contrary to the biblical idea in which Yahweh has no needs. Great symbiosis thinking, which pervaded the religious systems in the ancient world, was based on mutual needs. The relationship between the Great Symbiosis and the ziggurat can be recognized through an understanding of the giganu, the shrine at the top of the ziggurat. It was a rectangular-shaped structure bordered by a reed fence and a stand of cedar trees that occupied the top of the ziggurat. The giganu served as the residential quarters for the god when he was not actively involved in temple duties. It is not a place for the image to receive worship or sacrificial rituals. He is, quote-unquote, off duty. The inner room in the giganu, called the Room of Darkness, is for sleeping. Provisions were also made for food, bathing, or being anointed. Now that's talking specifically about the gods there. This is the way that these ancient people would have thought about the deity residing on top of this ziggurat. Walton continues. When great symbiosis thinking is brought to the context of Genesis 11, we can perceive an important nuance in the builders' desire to make a name for themselves. In the past, when this motivation was evaluated, it was often indicated that the builders' offense was in the fact that they were trying to make a name for themselves rather than allowing God to make a name for them. We propose instead that the contrast is not found in the verbal action, making a name rather than not making a name, nor in the subject, them making a name rather than God making a name, but in the indirect object, a name for themselves rather than a name for God. If sacred space is being constructed, as a ziggurat would suggest, its objective should be making a name for God, not for making a name for themselves. Note, for example, in Enuma Elish, let us build a sanctuary whose name is famous. Great symbiosis thinking, however, could easily lead to a motivation focused on their own success and well-being. That is, their motivation for constructing sacred space was to bring benefit to themselves. The ideal that construction of sacred space ought to make a name for the deity is reflected both in the ancient Near Eastern literature, such as in the names of ziggurats or temples, and in the biblical ideology. Such an offense does not represent encroaching on divine boundaries, as has often been suggested as the offense of the builders, in other words, going up to heaven when they should have stayed on the land. Rather, it's more about diminishing divine attributes. The builders were attempting to establish sacred space, itself a commendable activity, but their motivations were flawed. At this point, it's obvious that all the main interpretations of the offense of the tower builders are being called into question. They're not trying to ascend to heaven. They are not ostensibly guilty of pride, and they're not disobeying a command to fill the earth. The ziggurat was part of a system in which the gods descended to inhabit the image that had been prepared to contain their essence, and through that image, the god would be cared for through rituals designed for that purpose. The text does not articulate this system, but it doesn't need to. The symbol of the ziggurat spoke clearly to the Israelites familiar with its function. Jacob's dream in Genesis 28 is further evidence of this understanding. End quote. Okay, I know that was a lot there, but I think that's a really helpful section of that book, Lost World of the Flood. It helps us to understand what this ancient context would have actually been for people hearing this story. And it's pretty different from what we normally think of today. So I appreciate Walton's contribution there. And I would even recommend checking out that book, Lost World of the Flood by John Walton. It will help you to understand the context. So if you liked this little section that I gave from his book there, definitely check that out. It is a fascinating read. Moving into verse 4, I want to draw attention to something that Bible Project has pointed out, and I think this is a fantastic study that they did. They point out that God is actually the first builder in Scripture. Because if you remember from chapter 2, the words that are used of the creation of Eve, or Isha, the first woman, are construction terms. So it's like God is seen as the first architect. And what he built with Eve was an etzer, a help for Adam, a partner. Cain, Lamech, and Nimrod all built as well, but what they built were cities. And city in Hebrew is the word Ir. Now, Ir and etzer are relatively similar in Hebrew, the only difference being the length of the middle letter. So it's almost like the text is trying to get us to think of Cain, Lamech, and Nimrod as all trying to build helpers, protection for themselves, almost like what God provided to Adam, the first human. He created an etzer, and they're looking to build these ears because they can't make their own etzer. They can't make woman, so what they do is they create something else to be a support for them, a protection from other human beings. And then it seems, without coincidence, that cities are often described in feminine terms in the Bible. Really fascinating study, and I love how they work that out in their podcast. Now let's talk a little bit about this city, because you should not be thinking of modern-day cities. New York, San Francisco, London, Tokyo, nothing like that. These ancient cities were much smaller. They would be relatively small enclosed areas. Basically what made a city is you had a wall around it. It wasn't just a town or a village, because that would have just been the houses and maybe a couple common areas. What made a city in the ancient world is having a wall there. The IVP Bible Background Commentary goes on to describe cities as saying that they weren't really designed for people to live in. They housed the public sector, for the most part religious buildings and storage facilities enclosed by a wall. Since the government of these early cities was made up of elders connected to the temple, there would not have even been separate government buildings, though there may have been residences for these public officials. In other words, religious and political life were very closely intertwined. The determination to build a city suggests a move toward urbanization, which can easily be understood as a course of action that would prevent scattering. The cooperative living available through urbanization would allow more people to live together in a defined region, as it would allow for large-scale irrigation and excess grain production. The need for non-urbanized people to scatter is well demonstrated in the story of Abraham and Lot in Genesis 13. They continue. The central feature of these early cities in southern Mesopotamia was the temple complex. Often the temple complex was the city. The temple complex in this period would have been comprised of the temple itself, where the patron deity was worshipped, and most prominently by the ziggurat. So here we go again with these ziggurats. Ziggurats were structures designed to provide stairways from the heavens, the gate of the gods, to earth, so that the gods could come down into their temple and into the town and bring blessing. It was a convenience provided for the deity and his messengers. These stairways were featured in the mythology of the Sumerians and are also portrayed in Jacob's dream in Genesis 28. As an aside, that's what we often call Jacob's ladder. It more than likely would have been something like a ziggurat. So not a ladder, but basically a pyramid-like structure. IVP continues. The ziggurats were constructed of a sun-dried brick frame filled with dirt and rubble and finished off with a shell of kiln-baked brick. There were no rooms, chambers, or passageways of any sort inside. The structure itself was simply made to hold up the stairway. At the top was a small room for the deity, equipped with a bed and a table supplied regularly with food. In this way, the deity could refresh himself during his descent. None of the festivals or ritual acts suggest that people use the ziggurat for any purpose. It was for the gods. The priests certainly would have to go up to provide fresh supplies, but it was holy ground. The ziggurat served as the architectural representation of the pagan religious developments of this period, when deity was transformed into the image of man. And speaking of the tower, they say, this phrase is reserved almost exclusively for the description of ziggurats in Akkadian usage. Additionally, there are some intriguing omens in the series entitled Summa Alu, which translates to if a city, that indicate an impending doom that hangs over cities or towers built too high. If a city lifts its head to the heavens, it will be abandoned, or there will be a change on the throne. A city that rises like a mountain peak will become a ruin, and if it goes up like a cloud to heaven, there will be calamity. End quote. That's fascinating. I think that is a really interesting connection there. I think we can also take something from the way it says that the head of the tower, or ziggurat, reaches to the heavens. It's a little weird to use the word head. It's almost like it's being described as a macro version of a human, where the head reaches to the abode of the gods. Now, if that sounds too far-fetched to you, just wait, because it's surely no coincidence that the only other time Shinar is given as a name for the region of Babylon in the Bible is in the book of Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant human statue with the head reaching high up, you could almost say, to the heavens. Even though in most of our Christian Bibles, Daniel is situated somewhere around the middle of the Old Testament, what happens in that story occurs very much toward the end of the Old Testament storyline. So it's kind of out of chronological order, but I think there is a very intentional comparison between this story of the Tower of Babylon and that story in Daniel, I believe it's chapter 3, of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar builds in Babylon. Now in verse 4, God comes down to see this city and tower. And that is exactly what the people wanted. They wanted the gods to come down. I think it's almost like these people were trying to create Genesis 6 all over again. Because you'll remember in Genesis 6, the sons of God come down from the heavens and intermarry with the human women. I don't remember if I mentioned this in those episodes or not, but tradition says that those sons of God descended on Mount Hermon. And Michael Heiser has done a lot of work on that. In fact, he has a really good book on it called Reversing Hermon or Hermon that I would definitely recommend you read. But since these people were in the plains, they didn't have a mountain for the gods to come down. So it's like they were creating this in order to invite another Genesis 6 to happen, which is kind of scary when you think about it and totally makes sense that God would want to stop this. But he, instead, is the one who comes down. Yahweh comes down to observe what's going on. And previously, I would have looked at the way this was worded and seen it as saying that the tower was puny or insignificant in God's sight. He had to come down to see it. They wanted to build this up to the heavens, but really God just had to bend down to even realize that it was there. But as I've studied this more, I realized that even though that sounds really pithy and nice in English, it's not the point of this. By their building this tower, they wanted the gods to come down. So it's not saying that God almost didn't notice it, but saying that he did exactly what they wanted him to do, exactly what a god was supposed to do with a ziggurat, and that was to come down to observe it. And this continues a theme of gods descending to observe a problem, like he did in the garden, like he did when Abel's blood came up to him in chapter 4. It happens again later in Sodom and Egypt. This is very much a pattern in scripture of Yahweh descending from the heavens to see what's going on in the human world and to respond to a problem. And that fits with even the way that the tower is described as going up. If you remember in chapter 4, Abel's blood came up to God. In chapter 6, God said, "The end of all flesh has come up before me." And now a tower comes up before him. So whenever something comes up to heaven in that sense so far in the story, it has not been a very good thing. And I do find it rather amusing and ironic that these people who wanted to make a name, we never actually learn their names. I think that's really intentional in this story, that their whole purpose was to create a legacy for themselves, and yet the text is completely silent on who they were. It's very much an intentional dig against these people. I think it could also be in contrast to the people of the name that God has created, because we talked about this last week. God is working through the line of Shem, and Shem's name means name. So God has already provided a name through Shem. He's already provided a Shem through Shem, and these people are trying to make a Shem for themselves. Really funny how that wordplay works. Now, time to make you a little uncomfortable. Because remember all those images that we picture from like Renaissance art of the tower being half completed and then God steps in and it's never finished? Well, that's not the way the story goes. In fact, the Bible's account tells us that the people finished the tower. Seriously, look back at chapter 5. Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built. And then, if we jump down to verse 8, after God decides to scatter them here, it says, Yahweh scattered them abroad from there on the face of the earth, and they left off building not the tower, but the city. So I think the implication in this, and several scholars are in agreement, is that the people actually finished the ziggurat. They finished the tower. And that only seems impossible to us because we're expecting a silo-like Leaning Tower of Pisa kind of thing that actually reaches up into the heavens. But that's not what they were doing. They were building a ziggurat, and that was something that they very well could have completed, and the text seems to say that. And then it's only once they finish this ziggurat that God comes down and he prevents them from finishing not the tower, but the city. The tower was already completed. And it's because he sees that he says, look, these people are one. They all have one language, and again, it's that word lip or message. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. That's a different word, but I think it links with the evil imaginations of the pre-flood people in chapter 6, when it said that the thoughts and imaginings of everyone's heart was always evil continually. So I think that it's trying to set us up as saying that the flood didn't actually fix anything. We are back to like a pre-flood state where these people are inviting supernatural interference into human life. This is just showing that we've regressed again. We've just started the whole thing over. Now, if you'll remember, God promised at the end of the flood never to be a helicopter parent again. He said, I'm not going to wipe out all of humanity again. So he's already boxed himself in here, and he can't do that same thing, even though they're making the same mistakes. So he has to do something different. So what a lot of translations will say is that he confused their language. That word confused, it's the word balal in Hebrew. And it's a cooking term that is used very often in the Torah for mixed substances. A good translation of it would be the word moistened. God moistened their languages here. And yes, I know that's a very uncomfortable mental image, but now you're stuck with it. God didn't take away the ability to speak a certain language here. He mixed up what they already had, and if you take the view that this isn't about their languages as much as their mentality, it may not even mean that God took one language and split it up into however many. It could be saying that he took their purpose, their message, their belief system, and that's what he shuffled up so that like maybe he started sowing seeds of discontent in some of these people so that they weren't on board with the message of the empire. And so they all just split up as different factions, different political factions grouped together here. So that is another possibility of what could be going on. The Net Bible draws attention to how the people constantly said, let us do this, let us do this. And then when God comes down to see this in verse 7, he says, come on, let us go down. So he's basically mocking their mockery of his language. He's repeating back the exact same terminology that they're using. And the Net Bible also pulls a really interesting quote from the book of Jubilees, where an angel is talking about this incident at the Tower of Babylon and says, Yahweh went down and we went down with him. And we saw the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So kind of an interesting correlation there. Now, going off of that Hebrew term balal, that is why the text says that this place became known as Bavel. It became known as Bavel because there Yahweh balald their speech. So there's kind of the play on words that's going on. Is because of the confusion, the balal that God caused, it is now called Bavel. So that's kind of a way that the Hebrew Bible explains place names, is it will find a similar word in Hebrew to the name of that place and try to draw a correlation between it. So that's what's going on here. It's also important to realize that the word Babylon translates roughly to gate of the gods. That sounds a heck of a lot like Eden, because you remember when Adam and Eve left Eden, God put cherubim at the gate of the garden. And that is where I think, and some other scholars as well, that Cain and Abel were trying to give their sacrifice at the gate of the garden. So Babylon is like an anti-Eden. It is its own version of Eden, trying to give this different message from what Yahweh presents. Now, the next roughly 15 verses are an expanded version of the genealogy from the previous chapter. So this goes from verses 10 through 26, and it's giving several of the same names from the previous chapter, but in a little more detail. Because now that we have finished this story with the Tower of Babylon, we are ready to transition into the story of Abraham. Now, even though we're not going to be talking about Abraham in this series, that will be another series for another time, I think it's important that we draw attention to this, because Abraham is God's answer to the Tower of Babylon. In every other story, God has offered an alternative or a way out. When humans failed in the garden, God said, don't worry, we're going to fix this. When God wiped out humanity with a flood, he saved some through Noah. Here at the Tower of Babylon, there is no salvation that happens. There is no alternative. God does not offer a way out. He doesn't say, oh, some of you don't get subject to this confusion that's happening. It seems like he just applies it to all of humanity. So we have to read the Abraham story as a response to the Tower of Babylon. Abraham is God's response to what the people did at Babylon. They tried to do this their own way without seeking the approval of a God. So God says, that's fine. I'm going to do this my own way. And I'm going to choose a person from this people group in this general region where you screwed this whole thing up. And I'm going to start something new. Now, in verse 26, we are introduced to Terah, who is Abraham's father. And Terah is said to have 3 sons. Abraham, or Abram, in this part of the story, he's not called Abraham until later. Nahor, and Haran. I think by giving us these 3 sons, we are meant to view Terah in light of Adam and Noah. Those were the 2 main characters in the story so far, and they also have 3 sons listed. Cain, Abel, and Seth, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So now we have a new Adam, if you will, just like Noah was a new version of Adam. Now we have Terah almost as a new Adam, and he has 3 sons as well who are going to carry on the story. Now Haran does not get very far. In fact, in just verse 28, he dies. And I think this is probably why Abram and Lot were so close in the rest of the story, because Lot's father passed away, so Abram kind of takes over as Lot's surrogate father, if you will. Even though the story from this point forward is going to focus specifically on Abram and his family, the Toledot, the genealogy, is given not of Abram, but of Terah. And I think the purpose for that is to keep Rebekah as part of the family. Now, this is jumping way ahead, but several chapters later, Abraham has a son named Isaac, and he needs a wife, and Abraham wants the wife to come from within their same general clan of people. So, by having this genealogy here, this Toledot, from Terah, Abraham's father, we're able to keep Rebekah as part of the family, because she comes from a different part of the family than Abraham did, but still under Terah, so it fits that way. Verse 28 has them living in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, some people think that this is not the region of Babylon that we usually think of, but actually further up northwest, and that is very possible. I will link to an article that addresses that, and I believe Michael Heiser addressed that in some episodes of his podcast as well. But just going off of the name, Ur of the Chaldees, it can literally be translated oven of the Babylonians. Now, come on. Can you think of any other story in the Bible that deals with Babylon and a massive oven? How about Daniel with the 3 U's, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the fiery furnace? Like, that is incredible. Again, Daniel would be toward the end of the story, so we have these hyperlinks from the very beginning of this story all the way to the end of the Tanakh story. That is just mind-blowing, the way that that works. The remaining couple verses of this chapter have Abram and Lot leaving the land of Ur of the Chaldees, and I believe that is very significant because if you take the position that these books were written around the time of the exile, then that means that Israel's story begins by leaving the region of Babylon, the place where they were in exile. So this would have been very meaningful to people who had lived in captivity, that they're saying our story actually begins when we leave this land that has us captive now. It gives hope that it will happen again and bring renewal to their story. That's beautiful. Verse 29 talks about Avram and Haran choosing wives. And this gets a little bit funky because later on we learn that Avram's wife Sarai is actually his half-sister. So there were some rabbis who would try to explain away that relationship by claiming that Sarai was actually Avram's niece, whose name is Iska here in verse 29. Now, I definitely recommend you actually grab a Bible and take a look at this because it can be very confusing if you're just listening to someone talk about it. But in Genesis 11:29, it mentions the wives of Avram and Nahor. It says Avram's wife was Sarai, Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iska. Now, Iska is not mentioned again. She's just randomly put there, and you have to go, why? Remember one of Michael Heiser's rules of Bible interpretation. If it's weird, it's there for a reason. It's important. So there's all kinds of debate that goes on about who this Iska could be. And some people think that it was actually just another name for Sarai. That is definitely possible. We don't know for sure. There's all kinds of information that you can find on that. Even Wikipedia has some info on Sarai and possible relationships to Iska, so I will link to that. There's a lot of significance even just in the names. The Net Bible observes that Sarai means princess or lady, and Sharatu was the name of the wife of the moon god Sin. So her original name, Sarai, sounds kind of like the Sharatu, and it may reflect the culture of which the patriarch was called, for the family did worship the gods in Mesopotamia. And then the name of the other wife, Milcah, means queen. More to the point here is the fact that Malkatu was a title for Ishtar, the daughter of the moon god. So the Net Bible doesn't take this position, but some scholars do, that it's possible that Sarai and Milcah were like priestesses in these different cults in ancient Ur, specifically the ones related to the goddesses Sharartu and Makutu. It's possible. We don't know that for sure. It certainly seems like Avram and his family may have been polytheists in this culture. I mean, that just would have been standard at that time. There is nothing in the text to suggest that he was solely a Yahweh worshiper. Rather, Yahweh is the one who pulls him out of that, and throughout the rest of his story, you see him growing accustomed to what this relationship with this single deity Yahweh is like. But there are times, especially in his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, that we kind of wonder if he had experience in pagan cults. But that is all another conversation for another day. I just wanted to introduce it since they are here at the end of this chapter. The key that is mentioned here is in verse 30, where it says that Sarai was barren, she had no children. That is really important because her inability to have children means that she was unable to be fruitful and multiply. So this is a person who doesn't even have the ability to fit the creation blessing. I don't like to use the word mandate, the creation blessing from God, and yet he is going to find a way to use this family to bring everyone back to Eden. In verse 31, they travel into the land of Canaan. So this links right back to the previous chapters, and this is where the descendants of Ham's son Canaan are living. Although we don't have any reason to necessarily be suspicious of them at this point, what we will find is that later on they do not behave very well toward Avram and his family. Verse 32 tells us that the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So we see a significant drop in age from the pre-flood days. And different theories are given for this. Some people think it was related to there no longer being a dome over the earth with a flood. We've talked about why that would not be a viable option, since in the biblical mindset, the dome is still there. Some people think this is just a result of sin nature, that it progressively corrupted people as time went on. Some people think it's the life habits that people took over time. Things like eating meat actually decreased the lifespan of humans. Other people just take a position that this is ideological. In other words, it is trying to explain how we got from people having such long lifespans back in the day to people having shorter lifespans today. The text never specifically states why that happened. It just states that it did happen. Now, if you want more on the long lifespans of people at this point in the biblical story, you can go back to some of the episodes where we have talked about that in the genealogies there. Okay, we have made it all the way through Genesis 1 through 11, so thank you for being a part of this series. I have really enjoyed doing this study. I believe firmly that the more you understand about these first 11 chapters of the Bible, the more you will be able to get a grasp of the entirety of the rest of the Bible. So many themes hinge on the contents of these 11 chapters, that the more comfortable you are with these chapters, the more that you study these and understand the ancient culture, the more the rest of the Bible will just start to pop. You won't even realize it. You'll just be looking at some other passage and you'll start to make connections back to what was happening in these 11 chapters. So it is a majorly important part of our scriptures to understand. And we have now come to the end of this. So moving forward, we are not going to keep going in Genesis, at least for the time being. I want to give you a little bit of a change of pace rather than just going, because Genesis goes on for 50 chapters. So that would take quite a while. Instead, we're going to change it up, and we have one more episode in this series before we officially finish out the series. That's going to be another Q&R question response. So be sure to send in your questions. You can do that via email, ccon@thebibleuncut.com, ccon@thebibleuncut.com. You can send an email via the form on our website. You can comment on our socials. Or there is also a new feature on Spotify, where if you're listening on Spotify, you can put questions in there at the end of the episode as well. So that's a new way that we've added in that you can reach out. And then after the Q&R, we are going to do a Christmas special episode. And then we're going to take a couple of weeks off just to be able to enjoy the holidays and to get ready for the upcoming year. We have so much planned for 2024 in what we want to bring to you with this podcast. I am so excited for some of the series that are going to happen, for some very, very special episodes that are going to be one-offs, but they are going to be fantastic. And we've got some new shorts material coming out, all kinds of exciting things. I am so pumped about what's coming up, and I hope that it will continue to be an encouragement to you as we try to better understand the ancient context of these scriptures. So if you have found this helpful, would you take a minute and share it with a friend? You can share it on social media. It also helps if you can like and review. Now, most podcast platforms will let you like or give a star rating, but then there are a couple, I think Apple and Spotify might be the only ones that let you actually give like a review of it. Those do truly make a difference. And just this past week, I saw a massive spike in people who have been recommended this podcast just on their homepage of their podcast app. So it's getting activity. And the way that that happens is by more people reviewing it and recommending it. So we really appreciate your help in that. And that's all I got for this week. So next week, we'll be wrapping up with the Q&R episode. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about your uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.